Beneath the glittering chandeliers of Gilded Age New York, a forgotten young woman dares to step into a ballroom where whispers of her ruin cling to every wall. Her hand has been rejected by all, until the city's most feared magnate fixes his gaze upon her, igniting a scandal that will shatter pride, awaken forbidden desire, and test the very limits of love and survival. What begins as a bargain soon becomes a battle between silence and truth, power and vulnerability, steel and heart. Welcome, dear listener. Tell me, from where in the world are you joining us tonight? And let me ask, what do you love most about historical romances? The passion, the secrets, or the triumph of love against all odds? New York City, winter of 1876. The air outside was cold and dry, but inside the Langford mansion, the warmth of crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and candlelit splendor wrapped the ballroom in a golden haze. Violins sang beneath the domed ceiling. Laughter danced across marble floors, and yet, for one young woman standing near the edge of it all, the night shimmered with the ache of invisibility. Julia Whitfield stood still beneath a towering palm frond placed in a gilded urn, her gloved hands clasped tightly at her waist. Her gown was modest compared to the dazzling creations swirling around her, a pale blue silk with pearl buttons and a high lace collar, years behind current fashion. The sleeves hugged her arms modestly, ending in cuffs of delicate white tulle. Her mother had altered it with care, but no amount of stitching could disguise the fact that the Whitfields no longer belonged to this world. Her dark, chestnut hair was arranged in a simple chignon, held with a single mother-of-pearl comb. She wore no necklace, only the faint blush of pride on her cheeks and the fragile defiance in her eyes. Eyes that followed the swirl of satins and diamonds and gold-embroidered gowns moving like a parade of privilege. "Poor girl," murmured a woman passing by in a gown of emerald green, her words meant to sting as much as to be overheard, still hoping someone will look past the dust of the Whitfield name. Julia swallowed the bitterness and lifted her chin. She would not look away. Not tonight. She had danced only once, at the very beginning of the evening, with an elderly bachelor known for his loose spectacles and fondness for Madeira. Since then, her dance card remained untouched, a pale ribbon trailing from it like a white flag of surrender. Her mother, Mrs. Agnes Whitfield, lingered near the punch table, pretending not to notice the wall of silence surrounding her daughter. Her face was a study in failed determination, the pride of better years stitched into every line. But it was Julia who bore the weight, not just of a crumbling name or a dwindling dowry, but of the invisible cruelty of those who measured a woman's worth by the gleam of her diamonds and the reach of her father's influence. And then, like the first gust of wind before a storm, he entered, Jonathan Blackthorne. He did not arrive with fanfare. He did not need to. His presence drew the attention of the room as effortlessly as iron to a magnet. Standing in the wide arch of the ballroom doors, tall and severe in a black tailcoat and deep grey waistcoat, he scanned the room not like a man seeking company, but like one taking inventory of a world he owned. His eyes, ice blue and unflinching, moved across faces, silks, jewels, until they stopped on her. Julia felt it before she saw it, that shift in the air, that hush in the music that lived only within her chest. When she turned her head and met his gaze, it was as if the air between them thickened, heavy, with something unspoken. He did not smile. He did not nod. He merely looked at her, and in that look was something no one else had offered her all night. Attention, curiosity, stillness. She stood motionless, her heart thudding beneath the whalebone bodice of her dress. What could a man like Jonathan Blackthorne want with a woman like her? He was steel and empire. She was muslin and memory. And yet, without breaking their gaze, he began to cross the room. Whispers followed him like a tide, clinging to his coattails. Is he coming to speak with her? He must be looking for Caroline, not Julia Whitfield. That would be absurd. The crowd parted. Julia stood frozen. She could smell the beeswax polish on the floors, feel the silk of her gloves growing warm in her hands. Her lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in something deeper, something more dangerous. He stopped before her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice low and smooth with the faintest edge of steel beneath its civility. "You are unaccompanied." "My mother is nearby," she replied, her voice calm, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "She enjoys observing more than participating." He glanced in the direction of the punch table, nodded once, then returned his gaze to hers. "I would like the next dance," he said. A beat of silence passed before the meaning struck her. "The next?" "Yes." His expression remained unreadable. "If you are agreeable." Julia could barely form a word. She was too conscious of the eyes now pinned to her back, of the hush spreading like oil across the floor, of the clench in Caroline Ashford's jaw from across the ballroom. She extended her hand. He took it. The contact was light, proper, and yet it felt like fire through fine kid leather. They moved to the center of the floor, and the orchestra, as if sensing the scandal it was about to ignite, launched into a waltz. His hand found the small of her back, not too firm, not too familiar, but strong enough to remind her that this man held entire industries in his grasp. They danced, and as they turned beneath the chandeliers, Julia felt 1,000 eyes pierce her skin. But for the first time in her life, she did not shrink from them. For the first time, the world looked back at her not with pity, but with shock. And at the center of that storm was a man who had never once looked away. The waltz ended. He released her hand, bowed slightly, and without a word, turned and walked away, leaving her there, breathless, alone once more, but not forgotten. The invitation arrived the very next morning, delivered not by servant, but by private courier. An envelope of cream vellum sealed with a heavy crest in dark blue wax. Its presence on the worn parlor table seemed almost absurd, a thing out of place amid the faded drapery and threadbare carpet of the Whitfield townhouse. Mrs. Agnes Whitfield clutched it in trembling hands, her eyes wide with both wonder and alarm. She read the name, Jonathan Blackthorne, twice, her lips moving as though in prayer. Julia stood near the window, the pale morning light catching in her hair, her arms crossed over the bodice of her walking dress. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the far-off sound of carriage wheels. "It is not an engagement," Julia said at last, her voice quiet but firm. "It is merely a visit." "A visit to his private residence," her mother replied, her voice breathless. "Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what they will say?" "I understand very well," Julia murmured, though her gaze remained fixed on the street beyond. "I understand too well." She did not have to ask who they were. Society, always watching, always ready to strike with velvet words and iron judgment. To them, she was the girl who had lingered too long in the ballroom shadows, the one who had danced with no one, until the most powerful man in New York had chosen her for reasons no one could explain. Agnes stepped forward, the letter still open in her hand. "You must go. You mustn't hesitate, Julia. Think of what this could mean, for both of us." Julia turned slowly, her face composed, but her heart already aching with the weight of expectation. "I am not a pawn, Mother." "No," Agnes said softly, "but the board is already set. You may not be able to change the game, but you can choose how to move." By the time the carriage was sent, an elegant black brougham emblazoned with the Blackthorn crest, Julia had already decided that she would not go as a beggar. She would go with her head high, her gloves spotless, and her silence sharp as glass. The ride to Fifth Avenue passed in silence. The city bustled outside the frosted windows, but inside the carriage it was as though time had paused. Julia's heart beat with a rhythm too steady for what she felt. It was not fear. It was something quieter, heavier. When the carriage slowed before the Blackthorn residence, Julia drew in her breath. It was not merely a house. It was a palace of stone and steel, 4 stories tall, crowned with wrought iron balconies and sweeping arches. Wide marble steps rose to a grand entrance, flanked by Corinthian columns, their capitals carved with lions and laurels. Frost clung to the edges of the ornate glass panes, and 2 liveried footmen stood rigid at the doors, like statues guarding a treasure. As Julia stepped down, she was enveloped in a strange stillness. There were no curious passers-by, no watchful eyes. Only the wind, whispering against her cloak, and the quiet dread that she was crossing a threshold she might never return from. Inside, the house was warmth and shadow and golden light. A butler in a starched white cravat received her without flourish, leading her across a mosaic-tiled vestibule into the heart of the mansion. The air was scented with beeswax, leather, and a faint trace of sandalwood. The silence was not oppressive. It was sacred, as if the walls themselves had been sworn to secrecy. Julia was taken to a drawing room, unlike any she had ever seen. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, adorned with painted frescoes of myth and marble. A crystal chandelier hung above a Persian carpet so intricate it seemed to shimmer. Velvet drapes in deep garnet-framed tall windows, and everywhere, on mantels, consoles, and polished tables, rested gilded clocks, porcelain figurines, and books bound in calfskin. And yet, it felt curiously cold, as though all its splendor had never known laughter. She had only a moment to collect her breath before he entered. Jonathan Blackthorne stood at the threshold, his silhouette striking beneath the heavy carved lintel. He wore a dark morning coat over a dove-grey waistcoat, a simple cravat tied with elegant precision. He looked every inch the man whose name commanded steel and fortune, whose eyes could freeze a room into silence. And yet, Julia saw it again, that same quiet solitude she had glimpsed in the ballroom. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice as steady as the ticking clock behind her. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." She inclined her head with measured grace. It was unexpected. He motioned to a settee near the hearth. "Would you sit?" "I will stand," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "For now." He studied her a moment, then stepped further into the room. He did not approach quickly, but with a deliberateness that matched the rhythm of the room itself. "You must be wondering why you are here." Julia lifted her chin. "Society wonders many things. I have no interest in their conclusions. But yours, Mr. Blackthorne, those do interest me." A flicker, perhaps amusement, perhaps admiration, touched his features before vanishing. "I observed you the other night," he said, moving toward the fire. "You stood in silence while others paraded their wealth and wit. You endured humiliation without flinching, and when offered a dance by a man with a questionable reputation," he looked at her now, fully, "you accepted with poise." She said nothing. "I admire that." "And what is it exactly you admire, Mr. Blackthorne?" she asked, her tone careful, measured. "My composure, my silence, or the fact that no one else did?" For a brief moment, something raw passed through his eyes. It was not anger, it was recognition. "You are not like the others." "No," Julia said quietly. "I never had the luxury." The silence stretched between them, filled with things unspoken. He looked toward the hearth, as if the flames might offer answers. "I invited you here because I value clarity. In business, in character. I don't believe in wasting time with charades." "And yet," she replied, "this house is full of masks." That caught him. His gaze returned to hers, sharper now, more curious than before. "You see more than you allow others to notice. I've had a great deal of practice." He moved to the sideboard and poured a single glass of port, then offered it to her. Julia took it, but did not drink. "I did not come here for games, Mr. Blackthorne." "I don't play games, Miss Whitfield." She met his gaze fully now. In the flicker of firelight, she saw it again, that terrible aching distance behind his eyes. A man surrounded by finery, yet untouched by warmth, and she wondered, not for the last time, what kind of wound could build such a fortress around a man's soul. He spoke again, more softly this time. "If you are uncomfortable, you may leave." Julia stepped closer, not enough to invade, but enough to be felt. "If I were frightened, I would not have come at all." Their eyes locked, and in that breathless space between them, something passed, a flicker of understanding, a question neither dared to ask. The butler returned to announce that the carriage had been prepared. Jonathan offered no protest. Julia placed the glass back on the tray untouched. As she reached the threshold, he spoke her name. "Miss Whitfield." She turned. He did not move. "Would you return?" Her heart beat once, sharp and full. "I don't yet know," she said. And then she was gone, her steps echoing through a mansion that had known too much silence for too many years. The snow had melted into soiled slush along Fifth Avenue, but inside the drawing rooms of Manhattan's elite, the chill had only just begun to settle, carried not by weather, but by the far more dangerous frost of scandal. And at the center of it all stood the name Julia Whitfield, now spoken in the same breath as Blackthorn, a name whispered with both curiosity and cruelty behind fans and champagne flutes. Within 72 hours of her visit to the Blackthorn mansion, the drawing rooms ignited. First in hushed tones, then with growing boldness, the social circles of New York began to feast on speculation. "She must be desperate," sighed one matron in a silk damask gown, the color of bile. "Of course she is," replied another. "Her family lost everything except that crumbling townhouse on Lexington. What else is left for her but to throw herself into the arms of power?" "But Blackthorn," a younger debutante interjected, "he's not even titled. He's money, not blood." "That's precisely what makes it vulgar, my dear." No name was spoken more viciously than Caroline Ashford's, whose displeasure at Julia's sudden visibility pulsed through the city like a poisoned vein. Blonde, resplendent and bred for the spotlight, Caroline had been widely presumed the next to catch Jonathan Blackthorn's attention. That she had been passed over, and for Julia, was not just an insult. It was an unthinkable affront. Caroline did not retreat. She retaliated, with smiles like silk and words like blades. "She's clever, I'll give her that," she told a cluster of society ladies during a luncheon in her family's conservatory. To wear humility like a ribbon, so tragic, so brave, so untouched by modern fashion, it must be exhausting to pretend so well. Laughter followed, thin and cutting. "She visits him in his home, you know. Alone," Caroline added, her green eyes glittering with manufactured innocence. What conclusions can we draw from such intimacy? By the end of the week, the city knew the narrative. Julia Whitfield, a once-forgotten girl, now elevated by mystery. A social orphan clinging to the coattails of an empire. And then came the Ashfords' winter soiree, held in their mansion on the corner of Madison and 52nd. It was the first true ball of the season, and every candlelit sconce, every decanter of brandy, every gold-threaded curtain seemed chosen not for elegance, but for spectacle. Caroline, of course, stood at the center of it all, crowned in a gown of sea-foam silk and diamonds that glittered with pointed intention. Julia was not meant to attend. She had not been invited, not officially. But an envelope had arrived at the Whitfield townhouse the morning prior, unsigned, but bearing the unmistakable seal of the Ashfords. Her mother had clutched it with hope. Julia had looked at it with caution. "She means to humiliate me," she had said plainly. "Then go," Agnes replied, "and deny her the satisfaction." Julia's gown that evening was a quiet rebellion. Soft ivory satin with long fitted sleeves, no embellishment but the faint shimmer of pale blue embroidery along the hem. Her hair was swept back into a low twist, her only adornment a small silver comb and a pair of pearl earrings her mother had once worn on her own debut. As she entered the ballroom, conversation faltered, not stopped. never that obvious, but stumbled, reshaped itself into the kind of stilted civility that masked judgment with courtesy. Julia moved through the crowd with the grace of someone who knew she did not belong and refused to care. She accepted no wine, no fans, no offered compliments. Her eyes scanned the crowd once, and though she would not admit it to herself, she searched for one face. He was not there. Not yet. She lingered near the periphery of the ballroom, the lace fan in her hand unopened. She felt the glances, the darted whispers, the half-curtsies that meant nothing. Her gloves were pristine, but her pride bore the smudges of every stare. "Miss Whitfield," came a voice behind her, sweet as poison. Julia turned. Caroline stood a mere 2 steps away, smiling like a cat before the pounce. Her gown shimmered with movement, cut low in the latest Parisian fashion, her coiffure pinned with emeralds. "I'm so pleased you could join us. I confess, I wasn't certain you would." "I rarely attend performances," Julia said evenly, "but tonight I made an exception." Caroline's smile sharpened. "You look charming. That shade of ivory is quite forgiving." Julia inclined her head. "I find simplicity always reveals what embroidery seeks to distract." The smile faltered, just for a moment. "I hope you'll forgive the chatter that's surrounded you lately. Society does enjoy its little dramas." "Yes," Julia replied, her voice cool, steady. "But true character never needs applause." Caroline's fan fluttered, her knuckles white. "Enjoy the evening, Miss Whitfield. Do take care." And with that she disappeared into the crowd like a snake through silk. Julia turned back toward the windows, her breath shallow. Her chest ached, not from humiliation, but from restraint. Every muscle burned with the effort of remaining composed. It was then that she sensed him. Before she saw him, before the crowd even reacted, she felt his presence ripple through the room like the shift in wind before a storm. Jonathan Blackthorne had arrived. He did not wear extravagance. His tailcoat was black, his waistcoat charcoal, his cravat a crisp white folded in quiet elegance. Yet the room reoriented itself around him. Men straightened, women turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. His gaze found her. It did not linger on the chandeliers, nor the marble columns, nor the glittering neckline of Caroline Ashford. It moved past all of it, and settled on the woman in ivory standing alone by the window. He did not smile, but he did walk toward her, not fast, not theatrical, but deliberately, with the gravity of a man who did not need to raise his voice to command a world. Julia turned slightly, her breath caught. When he reached her, he did not bow. He merely said, in a voice low enough for her alone, "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Blackthorne," she replied, her tone like silk wrapped over steel. "I had not expected to see you here." "Nor I you. Do you wish to leave?" Julia paused. The question was not born of rescue. It was something else. A test, perhaps, an acknowledgement. "No," she said, "let them look." He studied her face then, not with lust, not with amusement, but with something rarer. Respect. He did not take her hand. He did not ask her to dance. He only stood beside her for a moment, allowing the silence to speak louder than any waltz. The whispers grew around them, thick and anxious. Julia felt them brush against her skin like cold fingers. But for the first time she did not flinch. She had walked through fire, and he, beside her, had not stepped away. That night she did not dance. She did not smile. She simply stood, a silent flame amid the glittering frost, and though Jonathan said little, though his hand never touched hers, his presence was enough. It was a promise yet unspoken, a shield made of shadows. And Caroline Ashford, watching from across the room, understood one terrible truth. Julia Whitfield had not been lifted by pity. She had been seen, and she would not fall quietly. The air in New York that morning was grey with frost and heavy with a silence that seemed to press against the windows of the Whitfield townhouse. Inside, a single fire crackled in the hearth of the parlour, casting restless shadows on the worn damask wallpaper and the fading portraits of ancestors who had long since vanished into obscurity. Julia stood at the window, her gloved fingers resting lightly against the cold glass. Outside, the world moved on. Carriages clattered along the street, vendors called out their wares, and the smoke of industry curled like serpents above the rooftops. But within her, time had stilled. The letter in her hand was crisp, its seal already broken, the words etched into her memory like iron into stone. Jonathan Blackthorne had summoned her, not to a ballroom, nor to a promenade, but to his study, in private. Today. Her mother hovered nearby, pretending to mend a lace cuff that had long since frayed beyond saving. "You must go," Agnes said, not looking up. "If he wishes to speak privately, it means something has shifted. He would not risk the appearance of impropriety otherwise." Julia turned, her voice quiet but steady. "You speak as though this were a chess match." "It is a chess match," her mother replied. "And you, my dear, are no longer a pawn. That frightens them. It should not frighten you." Julia said nothing. Her heart beat with a strange rhythm, half dread, half defiance. She had survived gossip, endured silence, and held her ground beneath the weight of society's ridicule. But this was different. This would not be a dance or a whisper. This would be a decision. The carriage sent by Blackthorne arrived precisely at 11. Sleek, black, and polished to a mirror's sheen, it bore no crest this time. Discretion had replaced grandeur. A single footman opened the door for her and bowed without a word. She was dressed in a navy blue walking gown with velvet trim and a fur-lined mantle draped across her shoulders. Her hair, pinned in a modest twist, gleamed with restraint rather than ornament. There were no pearls, no perfume, only silence and a heart unwilling to be conquered. When she stepped into the mansion once more, she did not pause to admire its splendor. She had seen it, she had breathed its wealth. She would not be dazzled by it again. The butler, ever silent, led her through a different corridor this time, past the grand parlour, through a smaller hallway lined with oil portraits and sconces of dull gold, until they reached a heavy oak door at the end. He knocked once. "Enter," came the voice from within. The door opened, and Julia stepped into the heart of the Blackthorne empire. The study was unlike the rest of the house. Its walls were panelled in deep mahogany, its shelves lined with thick volumes in leather and gold leaf. There were no mirrors, no chandeliers, only a large desk, a single fire burning in the hearth, and a man standing beside the window with his hands behind his back. Jonathan did not turn immediately. His profile was etched in shadow, his posture still and unreadable. "Thank you for coming," he said after a moment. "I assumed it was not a request," she replied, closing the door behind her. He turned then, slowly, and met her gaze. His eyes were clear, his expression unreadable. "I will not waste your time, Miss Whitfield," he said, "nor mine. I would expect nothing less." He motioned to the chair opposite his desk. "Please." She remained standing. "No, thank you." Jonathan studied her for a moment, then walked around the desk and took his seat. He opened a leather-bound folder, glanced at its contents briefly, then closed it again. "I intend to propose a union," he said calmly, "one that benefits both of us." Julia felt the breath leave her body, not with shock, but with the weight of inevitability. Still, she did not react. She had known, somewhere deep within her, that this was the path she had been led to. But the coldness of his delivery struck her like a slap. "A union," she echoed. "How romantic." He did not flinch. "I offer protection," he said, "and permanence, my name, my resources, and the shelter of a life unbothered by the pettiness of public opinion. In return, I expect companionship, civility, and your discretion." "And affection?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened. "That is not a requirement." "Of course not." She walked to the fireplace, her fingers brushing the carved mantel. The firelight warmed her cheeks, but her voice remained cool. "You speak of marriage as one speaks of business mergers. Efficient, predictable, cold. I am a man of function, not fantasy. And I am a woman of memory. she said, turning to face him. "I remember what it was to be seen, for a moment. That night in the ballroom. That moment mattered to me." His eyes darkened. "Then you misunderstood it." "Perhaps," she whispered. A long silence fell between them. He stood. "Society will destroy you, Miss Whitfield. It has tried already, but under my name it cannot." "You speak of protection," she said, "but what of value? Do you believe I possess none?" Jonathan crossed the room slowly, stopping only when he stood within reach of her. His voice, when he spoke again, was low, almost cautious. "I believe," he said, "that you possess a kind of strength I cannot buy, and that makes you dangerous. To them, and to me." Julia looked up at him, her breath trembling. "And yet you propose to chain me." "No," he said. "I propose that we bind ourselves to something neither of us can control. Let the world believe what it will, but between us, clarity." "Clarity," she repeated, "without affection, without tenderness, without illusions." She turned her gaze away, blinking back the sting behind her eyes. "I need time." "You have until tomorrow." The next morning, the Whitfield residence awoke to a front-page headline in the New York Gazette. Industrialist Jonathan Blackthorne announces engagement to socialite Julia Whitfield. By noon, it had reached every salon, every tea room, every whispering tongue in Manhattan. Some claimed it was a fabrication. Others said it was charity. Still others believed it a calculated move by a man who never did anything without reason. Julia said nothing. She sat at her writing desk that afternoon, the engagement notice spread before her, her name inked in bold script beside his. She traced the edge of the paper with a gloved finger, and when her mother entered the room, smiling through tears and dreams, Julia stood slowly. "I have accepted," she said. Her voice did not shake. It did not need to. The carriage moved slowly through the snow-lined streets of Fifth Avenue, its wheels muffled by the layer of fresh powder that had fallen overnight. Inside, the air was still, the windows frosted at the corners. Julia sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the soft rustle of her dove-grey travelling cloak the only sound she allowed herself. Her gloves were new, trimmed in velvet, and her bonnet had been selected carefully, not too modest, not too proud. Just enough to suggest that she was not there to conquer the house she was about to enter, but neither to beg for space within it. The Blackthorne mansion rose like a monolith at the end of the street, its tall windows glowing faintly with gaslight behind heavy drapery. It was not simply a home. It was a fortress carved in stone, its facade imposing, its silence unyielding. She had seen it before, of course. She had stood inside its grand halls and spoken words that had changed the course of her life. But now, as the carriage came to a slow halt beneath its portico, Julia knew she was not arriving as a guest. She was arriving as a promise. The butler opened the door with quiet precision and offered his hand to help her descend. Snowflakes caught in her hair, melting before they could chill her skin. She stepped forward, her boots barely making a sound on the polished steps. Her eyes lifted toward the towering entrance. The doors opened, and the house swallowed her. No one waited in the entry hall, no welcoming words, no soft chatter, no curious glances. Only the echo of her footsteps and the low hum of the chandelier above, its crystal arms gleaming like ice in the warm light. A maid appeared from a side corridor, young and fair, her expression carefully neutral. "This way, Miss Whitfield," she said, dipping into a small curtsy. Julia followed her through the grand vestibule and into a narrower wing of the house. Gone were the gilded frames and marble busts of the main halls. These walls were lined with dark wood, their sconces casting long shadows on oil paintings too old to be admired. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if watching her, as if weighing her worth. The maid opened a door to a chamber that overlooked the back gardens. The room was spacious, its furnishings elegant but subdued, a carved wardrobe, a writing desk by the window, a chaise in faded burgundy velvet. A fire burned low in the hearth, the flames restless, uncertain. "You may rest here," the maid said softly. "Dinner is at 7. Mr. Blackthorne is occupied." Julia turned to her, her voice gentle. "What is your name?" The maid hesitated. "Clara, miss." "Thank you, Clara." The girl's eyes flickered with something almost human, perhaps pity, perhaps admiration, before she curtsied again and left the room. Julia remained standing in the center of the chamber, her hands still gloved, her breath shallow. The silence pressed around her like velvet. She turned slowly, studying the details of the room. The fine moulding on the ceiling, the French wallpaper just beginning to peel near the corners, the faint scent of lavender oil mingled with old wood. This was not her home. It was his, and it was full of ghosts. Later that evening, dressed in a gown of dark plum silk and a single strand of pearls around her neck, Julia descended the staircase to the dining room. She walked slowly, her gloved hand grazing the polished banister, her eyes scanning the hallway's portraits. Faces stared down at her. Blackthorns long gone, men in high cravats and stern expressions, women with hollow gazes and stiffly arranged curls. None of them smiled. None of them seemed kind. At the far end of the hall, a door stood ajar. The dining room. She entered. Jonathan was already seated at the head of the table, his evening coat impeccable, his cravat tied with austere precision. He did not rise when she entered, but his eyes met hers with the quiet weight of unspoken expectation. "Miss Whitfield," he said simply. "Mr. Blackthorne." The footman pulled out her chair. She sat, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. The meal was served in silence. A cream soup, roasted pheasant, stewed apples with cinnamon. The cutlery gleamed, and the crystal glasses caught the light with delicate brilliance. And yet, nothing warmed the space between them. He did not ask how she had found the room. She did not ask where he had been all day. Instead, they ate like strangers at a funeral banquet. Only once, as the dessert was cleared, did he speak again. "I trust the accommodations were acceptable." "Yes," Julia replied. "The room is generous." He nodded. "This house has known few guests." "Then it must be lonely." A flicker crossed his face, something small, something real, but it vanished before it could be named. "Loneliness," he said, "is a byproduct of clarity, or of fear." His eyes lifted. "Do you believe I'm afraid of you?" "No," she answered, "but perhaps of what I might see." He stood abruptly. "If you'll excuse me." And just like that, he was gone. Julia remained seated for a long moment, the warmth of the room retreating from her skin. Then she stood, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, and followed the corridor not toward the stairs, but into the east wing of the house. It was darker here, quieter. She passed rooms with closed doors, their doorknobs polished, their secrets sealed. A portrait hung askew on the wall, a boy with dark hair and a wry smile, painted in vibrant strokes, unlike the cold ancestors upstairs. Beneath the frame, the nameplate read Samuel Blackthorne. She paused. A sound, faint and fleeting like the rustle of paper behind a door. She stepped closer, listening. Nothing. Then she turned the brass knob and pushed. The room was not lit, but the fire in the hearth had burned low. Shelves lined the walls, books, ledgers, old clocks, and a single writing desk at the far end. She stepped inside. On the desk, half hidden beneath a leather folio, lay a letter sealed in wax, unbroken. Its parchment was yellowed at the edges, its handwriting firm but unfamiliar. Julia reached for it, hesitated, then withdrew her hand. This was not her place. Not yet. But the shadows here whispered of things unspoken, estrangements, betrayals, regrets carved into silence. She turned and left the room, closing the door gently behind her. Back in her chamber, she sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly on the gardens. The trees stood bare, their limbs thin and brittle in the moonlight. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 9. She thought of Jonathan, of his distance, of the boy in the portrait with laughter in his eyes, and of the man she had agreed to marry, whose heart, she now knew, was not made of steel, but of scars. old, silent, and locked behind doors no key had yet opened. The invitation arrived on thick ivory cardstock, edged in gold and sealed with the emblem of the Ashford family, an intricate crest of roses and thorns entwined. It was not hand-delivered, but posted, arriving in the early afternoon when the winter light bled pale through the tall windows of the Blackthorn mansion. Clara, ever discreet, handed it to Julia without a word, and Julia took it without surprise. A masquerade, Caroline Ashford's most lavish affair of the season. Julia stared at the gilded letters for a long time. There was no note, no personal flourish, just time, date, address, and a command masquerading as invitation. She knew precisely what it was, an ambush. Still, she did not hesitate. She would go. The gown was prepared in silence. Not by seamstresses from Paris or by eager maids desperate for fashion, but by Julia's own calm direction. She chose black satin, not mourning, not submission, but quiet defiance, and paired it with a Venetian-style mask of deep emerald and gold leaf. Her gloves were ivory, and her hair, as always, was arranged in a low twist, adorned with a single dark plume. She did not seek to dazzle. She sought to endure. Jonathan said nothing when she informed him of her attendance. He merely looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a single nod before returning to his papers. The Ashford estate was ablaze with light. Torches flanked the entrance, their flames flickering against the marble columns. Carriages lined the drive like lacquered beetles, and masked guests ascended the steps in a tide of silk and laughter and carefully orchestrated mystery. Inside, the ballroom glittered. Candles burned in crystal chandeliers, suspended from gilded medallions. Velvet drapes hung heavy at the windows, and musicians in powdered wigs played a waltz that rippled across the parquet floor. Feathers and jewels danced in every corner. The air reeked of perfume, sweat, and privilege. Julia stepped inside alone. The hush was subtle but immediate. Conversations did not stop, but they shifted. A ripple of awareness passed through the crowd, like the faintest draught through silk curtains. She did not shrink. She moved with steady grace across the ballroom, her posture regal, her expression hidden behind her mask, but her eyes unwavering. Each step was measured, not prideful, not timid, just unshakable. Caroline found her near the edge of the dance floor, as Julia knew she would. The hostess wore silver and white, a gown that shimmered like moonlight, and a mask of glittering crystals that caught the firelight with every tilt of her head. Her voice when she spoke was wrapped in the kind of sweetness only a serpent could envy. "Dearest Julia," she purred, "what a delight to see you here. I confess I had not expected such bravery." "Bravery?" Julia asked, her voice smooth. "You mean civility." Caroline laughed lightly, her hand fluttering to her bejeweled fan. "Of course, though one never knows who might be in attendance at these events, it would be dreadful to find oneself in awkward company." Her eyes flicked toward the far end of the ballroom. There, standing beside a woman in a sapphire gown cut scandalously low, was Jonathan Blackthorn. Julia's gaze did not falter. Her spine did not stiffen, but something inside her, something soft and secret, folded in on itself. Caroline saw it. She moved closer, her voice lowering with feigned intimacy. "They say he is still quite social. That business is not the only thing he entertains after hours. Of course, I wouldn't dream of believing such things, but when one is offered so little explanation, the mind wanders." Julia met her eyes squarely. "Let it wander," she said quietly. "It's the only place it will ever be welcome." The smile on Caroline's lips curdled, but before she could reply, she stepped back with theatrical grace. "Oh, I do hope you'll enjoy the evening," she said sweetly. "There's a special performance later, something truly unforgettable." Julia inclined her head. "I'm certain it will be." As the night wore on, Julia remained by the large marble column near the edge of the ballroom. She did not dance, she did not seek conversation, but she did not leave. And that, perhaps, was what unsettled them most. Near midnight the music paused. The lights dimmed. A soft trill of strings rose in the hush, and two figures stepped into the center of the ballroom, Caroline, now unmasked, and a man wearing a Blackthorn-style mask and evening coat unmistakably similar to Jonathan's. A murmur spread through the crowd. The performance began, a stylized pantomime of a courtship. Caroline, draped in theatrical innocence, clutched a bouquet of red roses. The masked man circled her, offering wealth, offering jewels. She accepted, then rejected, then collapsed in a display of mock sorrow. The man, expressionless, turned and chose another, a woman in a faded dress, silent, still, plain. The crowd laughed. The woman bowed. Caroline, feigning heartbreak, turned away. The crowd applauded. Julia did not move. She stood there as the laughter grew, as the dancers resumed, as glasses clinked and whispers fluttered, and then, without ceremony, she stepped forward. She crossed the floor with the same calm precision she had entered with. She stopped before Caroline, who stood triumphant in the center of the crowd. Their eyes met. Julia did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She simply said, her voice low and clear, "Thank you for reminding them that theatre is best left to those who can pretend." And then she turned, graceful, unshaken. Behind her the silence spread like a stain. Some turned their eyes, some stared, but a few, a very few, watched her with something more than surprise, respect. Near the tall arched doors, Jonathan waited. He had watched the entire performance from the shadows. His face betrayed nothing, but his hands were clenched behind his back, his jaw tight. When she passed him, their eyes locked. She did not stop, but in that gaze, for the briefest moment, he saw not just the woman society had mocked, but the woman who had refused to break, and it terrified him, because he knew now she was no longer someone he had chosen. She was someone who had chosen to endure without him, in spite of him, and that, more than anything, made her dangerous. The days that followed the masquerade passed in a strange hush. Winter deepened, laying its white veil across the city, muffling the sound of hooves and carriage wheels, softening the angles of rooftops and iron railings. In the Blackthorn mansion, the frost pressed against the windows like fingers of glass, and the hearths burned constantly, casting long, flickering shadows across floors of polished walnut and velvet-covered walls. But no fire could warm the emptiness of the east wing. Jonathan Blackthorn had not left his study in 2 days. The household moved cautiously. Servants spoke in hushed tones. The butler, normally composed and unreadable, had lines of worry deepening around his mouth. Meals left outside Jonathan's door were returned untouched. Papers piled in the outer office. The doors remained closed. Julia noticed everything. She did not ask. She did not intrude. But each morning she walked past the study, pausing briefly to listen. The silence inside was not that of work or solitude. It was heavier. She could feel it in her chest, a dense quiet that pressed against the heart like a stone. On the third morning, Clara met her at the foot of the stairs, her expression pale. "He has a fever, miss," she whispered. "The doctor was sent for at dawn. He hasn't slept, not truly. He refused broth. There are concerns." Julia did not hesitate. She climbed the staircase slowly, each step echoing with the weight of choices not yet made. At the end of the corridor, the door to the study stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. Papers lay scattered across the desk and floor, as though tossed in frustration. The air smelled of ink, ash, and exhaustion. Jonathan sat slumped in a leather armchair by the hearth, his coat wrinkled, his cravat loosened. One hand rested against his temple, the other dangling a crystal tumbler, long emptied of whatever brandy it had once held. His skin, normally bronze with winter's bite, had gone pale. His eyes, when they opened, were glazed. "Miss Whitfield," he murmured, though he did not rise. "Don't speak," she said softly. "You need rest." I need quiet. You need care. She stepped forward and took the glass from his hand without asking. He did not resist. She placed it on the mantel, then turned back to him, studying the lines of wear beneath his eyes, the way his jaw tensed with pain even in stillness. He looked up at her, unfocused. I have too much to do. You will do none of it, she replied, her voice steady, until you stop trying to command your own body like it's another empire. He closed his eyes. The silence stretched between them. She moved quietly to the door, called for Clara, and gave precise instructions. Hot water, cloths, a new fire, a clean shirt, broth, and lemon water. The staff obeyed without question. That night, she sat beside him. She did not leave when the doctor came and muttered about exhaustion, about inflammation, about the need for sleep and stillness. She did not leave when the night deepened and the lamps dimmed. She remained at his side, a silent sentinel in satin and shadow. He did not speak for hours. Only when the fire had burned low and the clock struck 2 did his voice stir the silence. They all wanted something, he said hoarsely. Every single one of them. Julia looked at him. His head rested against the back of the chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. My mother wanted devotion. My father wanted loyalty. The investors wanted risk. The board wanted obedience. And Samuel, his voice broke slightly, she was never his to take. Julia did not speak. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Jonathan exhaled, long and bitter. He betrayed me for a woman who would have married either of us. She didn't care. I did. A beat passed. He turned his head slowly toward her. And that is the last time I ever believed in anything soft. Softness is not weakness, she said gently. It led me to ruin. It led you to truth. His eyes closed again. I don't want your pity. You don't have it. That startled him. He looked at her fully now, the weight of his stare anchoring her to the moment. Then what do you feel? Julia inhaled slowly, her heart beating painfully beneath the bodice of her dressing gown. I feel that strength built on bitterness eventually turns to ash, and that no empire, no matter how vast, can warm a man who closes every door. He sat up slightly, wincing. You think me cold. I think you afraid. He stared at her. Long, deep. Then, so quietly it nearly went unheard, he said, And you? What do you fear, Julia Whitfield? She stood, her movements graceful, quiet. She crossed the room to the desk and began tidying the scattered papers without responding. Only after a moment did she say, her back still turned, I fear becoming invisible again. He swallowed. And in that simple confession, something shifted between them, not like lightning, not like passion, like warmth, a flicker of something long buried. She returned to the chair beside him, laying a damp cloth across his brow. He did not stop her. Their hands touched, just briefly, as she adjusted the blanket, skin against skin. No words, only the smallest intake of breath from him. The fire snapped softly behind them, and for the first time in many nights, Jonathan Blackthorne slept. Julia remained, her gaze fixed on the dying embers. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not dare ask more of him than he could give. But in that quiet room, surrounded by shadows and crackling warmth, she saw the first fracture in his armor. Not a break. Not yet, but a beginning. The chandeliers of the Blackthorne ballroom sparkled like frozen constellations suspended in air. Flames flickered inside 100 sconces, gilded mirrors multiplied the light, and footmen moved like shadows along the velvet-lined walls. Everything had been prepared with meticulous precision. Every table gleamed. Every crystal goblet sang with clarity. Every guest had arrived in silk and expectation. It was the first banquet hosted in the Blackthorne mansion since the announcement of Jonathan's engagement, and Julia knew, with each step she took through that house, that it was not a celebration. It was a trial. The grand table extended the length of the hall, set with gold-trimmed china and an ocean of silver cutlery. Tall arrangements of winter roses and white lilies punctuated the space, their scent thick and cloying. The city's most powerful men and most critical women were seated in perfect order, and at the center of it all sat Jonathan, impeccably dressed, unreadable in expression, flanked by his associate Thomas Pembroke and, on the other side, Julia. She wore a gown of deep garnet silk that evening, with a high collar of embroidered ivory lace and sleeves that tapered to her wrists like elegant declarations of restraint. Her dark hair was swept into a low twist, pinned with a single ruby comb. Around her neck hung a slender gold chain, with a locket she did not open. She smiled when appropriate, spoke when expected, and drank very little. She had learned how to survive under chandeliers. But nothing could prepare her for the moment when the candlelight turned cold. Dessert had just been served, poached pears in honey and wine, when the conversation turned to legacy. Jonathan had been speaking with a senator about railway investments. The voices around the table hummed, glasses clinked, and servants moved in silence. Then Thomas Pembroke leaned forward. "I suppose it is admirable," he said with a polished smile, "how far some women are willing to rise when given the right name." The table hushed. Julia froze, her fork still poised in her hand. Jonathan said nothing. Pembroke went on, his tone dripping with casual cruelty. "In this era, it seems titles and fortunes are no longer earned, only borrowed or bartered." Several guests glanced uneasily toward Jonathan. Others stared at Julia with barely disguised interest. She set her fork down gently. "Mr. Pembroke," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel, "surely you're not implying that marriage is a transaction lacking in value beyond gold?" He smiled, slow and deliberate. "I would never insult the institution, only question the intentions of those who enter it with empty hands." A few muffled chuckles echoed down the table. Someone whispered behind a napkin. Jonathan lifted his glass, sipped once, and remained silent. Julia turned to him, just slightly. His profile was carved in stillness, his jaw locked, his eyes unreadable. He said nothing, not a word, not to her, not to them. The silence rang louder than the insult. Julia's chest tightened, her throat burned, and her heart cracked with the clarity of a bell. She stood. The scrape of her chair echoed through the hall. "I believe," she said, her voice cool and calm, "that no woman enters a room like this expecting fairness. But she may still expect decency." Gasps fluttered like doves in a storm. Jonathan looked at her then, but she had already turned. She walked the length of the table with dignity, her head high, her eyes dry. She passed the guests, the musicians, the servants. She crossed the marble floor beneath the chandeliers, beneath the portrait of the late Blackthorn patriarch, and did not stop until she reached the main hall. Only then, alone in the silence, surrounded by gold and grandeur, did her breath catch. Only then did she break. Not with sobs, with a single tear sliding down her cheek like a confession. She did not wait for a carriage. She did not wait for permission. She simply gathered her skirts and descended the steps into the snow-covered night, leaving behind the firelight, the laughter, and the man who had not defended her. In the ballroom, the conversation faltered. Jonathan remained seated, his expression unreadable. But those nearest him saw it, the slight tremor in the hand that held the glass, the pulse at his temple, the sudden hollow stillness that enveloped his frame. Thomas Pembroke turned to him, half smiling. "I hope I didn't offend." Jonathan's voice, when it came, was cold as steel. "You did." Pembroke blinked. "I only—" "Enough." Jonathan rose slowly, placing his napkin on the table. His gaze swept over the guests, freezing them in place. "I will not host parasites in my home." The room fell to silence. He left without further word. In the corridor beyond, the echo of Julia's steps had already faded. He stood alone in the archway, staring at the door she had passed through, a weight in his chest he could not name. It was not anger, it was not pride, it was something far worse, regret. Because in that moment, under crystal chandeliers and behind all the armor he had so carefully built, Jonathan Blackthorne realized that his silence had not protected her. It had destroyed her. The cold morning arrived like a whisper through glass. Frost clung to the corners of the Blackthorne mansion, etching delicate patterns across the windows, but inside, the silence was thicker than winter's hush. Julia stood by the window of her chamber, dressed already in a slate-grey wool gown, her hair neatly pinned, her hands motionless at her sides. The house felt heavier since the banquet. The laughter that once echoed faintly through its long halls had quieted. Even the servants moved more cautiously, their footsteps subdued, their glances lingering just a moment longer on her as she passed. The memory of that night still bruised her, not because of the insult alone, but because of his silence. Jonathan had said nothing, and that absence of defence had been more painful than any cruel word Pembroke had dared to speak aloud. She had not spoken to Jonathan since, nor had he sought her. But that morning, as the sun barely lit the city beyond the frost-glazed windows, a sound broke the stillness, a pounding on the front doors. Moments later, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors. Clara burst into the room without knocking. Her cheeks were pale, her voice urgent. "Miss Whitfield, there's been a fire at the Fifth Avenue Foundry, the large one near the river." Julia turned sharply. "Is Mr. Blackthorne?" "He left before dawn," Clara said breathlessly. "He went as soon as word reached him, but it's bad. The smoke can be seen all the way from the square, and the papers," she hesitated, "are already speaking of sabotage, and of scandal." Julia didn't wait for more. By the time the city had begun to wake, she was already moving through the mansion with a presence no one dared question. The staff looked to her, not out of obligation, but instinct. Because she moved with purpose, because she did not wait for orders, because the Blackthorne name, though never truly hers, rested that morning upon her shoulders like a weight only she could carry. She summoned the steward and the head footman to the drawing room and gave instructions. Food was to be prepared and sent immediately to the families of the Foundry workers. Blankets, medicine, warm water, all to be gathered and delivered to the East Quarter near the riverfront. A room on the ground floor was to be cleared for injured workers' wives and children who had nowhere else to go, and all of it was to be done in the name of the Blackthorne estate. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. By mid-morning, the house was no longer a mausoleum of silence, but a vessel of action. The kitchen roared to life, linens were gathered, footmen loaded wagons, and the staff moved like the gears of a well-oiled machine. And at the center of it all stood Julia, calm, composed, giving direction with quiet authority. It was Clara who brought her the paper, a single broadsheet, freshly printed, its ink still damp. At the top, Blackthorne Legacy in flames beneath it, in smaller type, Lady Misfortune at his side. Julia stared at the page, the inked lines of her name wrapped in speculation, a reprint of Pembroke's insinuations. Whispers of instability, of bad luck, of whispered curses brought into the house by the wrong kind of woman. And worse, an anonymous quote. "Some say the fires began not in the Foundry, but in the halls of his mansion." She said nothing. She folded the paper slowly, laid it down, and resumed her work. The house was her battlefield now, and she would not be defeated by rumors. That evening, the doors to the mansion opened again, and Jonathan returned. His overcoat was darkened with soot, his gloves stained, his face, normally composed and elegant, was drawn with fatigue, his hair disheveled, his expression unreadable. He entered the front hall and paused. The lamps had been lit, the floors freshly swept. The staff, though exhausted, moved with clear direction. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and warm bread, and in the center of it all stood Julia, not waiting, not apologizing, just standing, as if the storm outside had made its home inside her, and she had faced it without blinking. Their eyes met. He did not speak. He stepped toward her, slowly, as if the distance between them were heavier than the air in the Foundry. "I saw the papers," she said, voice low. He didn't answer. She took one breath. Then another. "I thought," she continued, "you might have denied the rumor, or defended me." His eyes softened barely. His mouth parted, but no words came. "I have no title," she said, quieter now, "no dowry, no lineage that grants me immunity from their malice. What I had was dignity, and I brought it into your house." She looked around, the walls bearing witness. "I've tried to carry your name with more grace than it was ever offered to me." He was silent, still, and yet something within him cracked. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "They say I built my empire from nothing," he murmured. "But it wasn't true. I built it from anger, from betrayal, from the ashes of trust." He paused. "I did not speak for you that night, not because you were unworthy, but because I've never known how to protect anything I did not own." A silence hung between them. He took another step toward her. "But you're not something to possess, Julia. You're something I could never deserve." She looked at him, really looked. And in that moment, she saw not the titan of industry, not the man who had stood by and let her be humiliated, but the boy he had once been, wounded, guarded, lost. And slowly she nodded. "Then earn me," she said. She turned away, ascending the stairs with grace, not fury. Her steps were light, controlled, but her eyes burned. Behind her, Jonathan remained in the hall, the firelight flickering across the marble floor, the scent of smoke still clinging to his coat. And for the first time in many years, he knew the difference between power and courage. He had seen both that day, and only one had worn his name with honor. The ballroom had never looked more opulent. Hundreds of candles flickered from the towering chandeliers, casting golden halos on the crowd below. Crystal glimmered on every surface. Strings played softly in the corner, and the scent of jasmine and brandy floated through the air like a whispered promise. The Blackthorn name had once again filled the room, not with scandal, not with tension, but with power. It was Jonathan's first public appearance since the fire, and it was a calculated one. The invitations had gone out in embossed envelopes trimmed in black and gold, stamped not with a hostess's crest, but with the industrialist's seal himself. It was not a seasonal fete, nor a business gathering. It was an evening of recognition, a term vague enough to stir both curiosity and speculation among New York's elite. They had come in droves. Julia stood near the edge of the ballroom, her gown a river of silver silk edged in delicate embroidery. Her hair, drawn back in a braided crown, shimmered beneath the light. She wore no diamonds, no heavy jewels, only a single red camellia at her shoulder. She did not speak much. She did not need to. Eyes followed her wherever she moved. Whispers clung to her train like perfume. "She came," murmured a woman near the stairs. "After everything," replied another, "she still came. Have you seen Caroline?" "No one's seen Caroline, but he is here, and he is watching her." From across the room, Jonathan stood near the grand fireplace, one hand wrapped around a glass of amber brandy, the other resting at his side. He was dressed in black, his waistcoat deep burgundy, his cravat tied with absolute precision. The bruises from the fire had faded, but there was a new weight in his shoulders, less guarded, more resolved. He watched Julia, not possessively, not protectively, but with awe, as though seeing her for the first time with the eyes of a man who finally understood what it meant to lose and what it meant to be loved despite it. The orchestra shifted its melody. A pause fell over the room. Then Jonathan stepped forward. He ascended the small platform at the far end of the ballroom, just beneath the portrait of his late father, and turned to face the crowd. A footman struck his cane lightly against the floor. The music ceased. Conversation froze. Jonathan's voice, when it came, was low, but it carried. "I've built my name on iron," he began, "and I've defended it with silence." A murmur. But silence, as some of you have seen, does not mean strength. And steel, despite its reputation, can crack under pressure. The room held its breath. There have been rumors, whispers, accusations thrown in drawing rooms and printed on paper. He glanced toward the Ashfords' corner. Caroline, pale, still, her lips pressed into a tight line. "And there have been those in this room," he continued, "who have fed those rumors, who have used their connections to undermine my family, my workers, and the woman who bears my name in spirit, if not yet in law." A gasp. Julia did not flinch. He turned fully toward the guests. "Thomas Pembroke," he said, and the name dropped like a stone, "was dismissed from my enterprise as of yesterday morning, for breach of contract, for misappropriation of funds, and for acting against my household in matters both personal and professional." Pembroke turned red, then white. The crowd stirred. Jonathan looked past him, straight at Julia. "There are many who believe power is taken. That reputation is built with profit. That dignity is a currency. But tonight I am here to tell you none of that is true." He walked down the steps. The crowd parted as he approached her. When he stopped before her, he did not bow. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, the room falling into a hush so profound even the candles seemed to still. "When I first offered you my name," he said quietly, "it was a bargain, a shield, a transaction built on fear. But I was wrong." He took a breath. "You never needed my name, I needed yours, or what it stood for, because you, Julia Whitfield, you gave dignity back to a house that had lost it. You carried it with grace when I lacked the courage to do so. You defended my workers, my legacy, and me, when I would not defend you." Her lips parted, but she could not speak. "I don't love you out of obligation," he said, his voice breaking just enough for the truth to escape. "I love you because you've seen every hollow place in me, and chose not to fill it but to stand beside it." A tear welled in her eye. She didn't blink it away. He reached into his coat and drew from it a small velvet box. "I have nothing left to offer you but myself. Not my wealth, not my empire, just my vow. And if you'll accept it, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your strength." He opened the box. Inside, a ring, simple, elegant. A single emerald, flanked by 2 narrow diamonds, not opulent, not showy, just sincere. Julia stepped forward. Her voice was steady, soft, but the entire room heard it. "I never wanted to be saved, Jonathan. I only wanted to be seen." "I see you," he whispered. She nodded, her voice trembling now. "Then yes." A murmur rippled through the room like wind through tall grass, but neither of them noticed. He slid the ring onto her finger, and the past fell away like smoke. They stood together beneath the same chandeliers that had once mocked her, that had once watched her dance alone, that had once flickered while others whispered her name like a curse. Now they whispered it like a vow. Julia Whitfield, no longer an outsider, no longer a pawn, but a woman seen, chosen, and loved in full. As the orchestra resumed and the guests erupted into applause, Jonathan took her hand in his, and together they walked, slowly, gracefully, through the gilded halls of Fifth Avenue. No longer master and ornament, but husband and wife, bound not by bargain, but by love, a love stronger than steel. Autumn had returned to New York in shades of amber and rust. The wind danced down Fifth Avenue, rustling the golden leaves that clung to wrought-iron gates and marble steps. Carriages still clattered past the grand mansions, though the city had changed. Higher buildings, brighter lights, faster voices. Yet amidst the growing skyline and shifting fashions, one house remained a symbol of quiet strength, the Blackthorn estate. Inside, the parlor was filled with laughter. A boy of 8, with dark eyes and a stubborn brow, knelt beside the hearth, building towers from dominoes, while his younger sister twirled in a tulle-trimmed gown, her curls bouncing with every spin. Julia watched them from the settee, her knitting forgotten in her lap, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. She was older now, but radiant still. The silver in her hair only heightened the warmth in her eyes, and the years had not dimmed the grace with which she carried herself. She wore a soft navy gown with lace cuffs, her wedding ring glinting as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. A familiar step echoed down the hallway. Steady, confident. Jonathan entered, pausing for a moment in the doorway to watch the scene unfold. His children, his home, her. He no longer wore the sharp severity of youth. Age had softened the edges of his face, but not his presence. He crossed to her, leaned down, and pressed a kiss to her temple. "You didn't light the fire yet," he murmured. "I was waiting for you," Julia replied. He sat beside her, lacing his fingers with hers. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the city glimmered with the promise of progress. But in that room, time had slowed, held in place by the love they had built brick by brick, glance by glance. Their son, Jonathan Jr., turned with a triumphant grin. "Mama, I built the Foundry." She laughed softly. "Then don't let it burn, my darling." Jonathan met her gaze, and for a heartbeat they remembered. The fire, the banquet, the silence, the vow. He brought her hand to his lips as if to say again what words no longer needed to carry. They had weathered years of scrutiny, at first polite, then admiring. Society had changed its tune with time, as it always did, bending toward fortune and power. But Julia had never sought their approval. She had earned something better: respect. Caroline Ashford had not married. She had withdrawn from public life after a series of failed suitors and a scandal involving forged invitations. Her name had vanished from the society columns, replaced by newer, shinier names. But some whispered that she still attended the opera, veiled and silent, her gloves impeccable, her smile faded. Thomas Pembroke had paid a far steeper price. Ruined by his own ambition, exposed for his fraud, he had attempted to rebuild his reputation in Chicago, but never returned to New York. His name was no longer spoken in polite circles. It was, as Jonathan once said, forgotten by the house he had tried to disgrace. As for the Blackthorn legacy, it had changed. The factories no longer ran on the backs of silent workers. Julia had helped establish schools near the foundries and a foundation for injured laborers' families. She insisted on names, on stories, on faces behind the steel. Jonathan had resisted at first, out of habit, out of pride. But in time, he saw the truth in her vision. It made the empire not just strong, but human. And now, a decade later, they had built not just wealth, but a home. Julia rose from the settee, moving toward the window as the first stars blinked into view. She looked out over the city, the lights flickering like memories, and felt the ache of time in her chest, not regret, not sadness, just the soft press of everything they had endured. Jonathan came to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "It's been 10 years, he said quietly. She turned, rested her cheek against his chest. "It feels like yesterday." He smiled. "And yet, you haven't changed." "I have," she whispered. "We both have." He kissed the top of her head. "And still, I'd choose you again. Without hesitation, without pride, without fear." She closed her eyes. "I'd choose you too, even knowing everything." Behind them, their children laughed again, unaware of the weight that once hung in these halls. Of the silences that nearly cost them everything, of the fire that nearly consumed them. Love had not spared them the trials, but it had survived them, stronger than steel, softer than silence, unbreakable. And in that quiet moment, under the soft hum of memory and the warmth of the fire that now glowed behind them, Julia and Jonathan Blackthorn stood side by side, proof that even in a world built on power and appearance, the truest legacy is the one forged by the heart. In a world that often rewards silence and punishes vulnerability, Julia and Jonathan's story reminds us that true strength is not forged in steel, but in the quiet resilience of the heart. Their journey was not easy, marked by betrayal, pride, and moments of painful doubt, but through it all they chose love, not the perfect kind, but the brave kind, the kind that dares to grow, the kind that sees. This tale is more than a romance. It's a tribute to every woman who has been underestimated, Every man who had to unlearn the armor he thought made him strong, and every soul that chose dignity over noise.